preface to a question.
Mr. Speaker, if I may continue uninterrupted. Last week, my honourable friend, the member for Dewsbury, raised the very specific issue of how many of the hundreds of abusive and violent messages she receives use the Prime Minister's own words. The Prime Minister dismissed these concerns as simply humbug. Since that exchange, my honourable friend has received 4 further death threats, some again quoting the Prime Minister's words. Death threats and abuse is something that women across this House experience. Will the Foreign Secretary take the opportunity to apologise on behalf of the Prime Minister for his initial dismissive response?
Can I thank the Right Honourable Lady, and my eagerness to rise to the dispatch box was only because it is fitting in Black History Month as the Right Honourable Lady becomes the first Black MP to take to the dispatch box for PMQs. To say that she has blazed a trail, she has made it easier for others to follow in her footsteps, and that is something that I and every honourable member in this House can take pride in paying tribute to. She raises the increasing level of online and wider abuse that politicians get on all sides of this House, and I think we should come together to be clear that there must be zero tolerance for any abuse or any threats. And can I also say I found the level of abuse that the Right Honourable Lady has received online to be totally disgusting, totally unacceptable. At the same time, and I'm sure as a passionate champion of free speech, she will defend our right in this House to defend the issues of substance. The remarks that the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, made were aimed at the suggestion that he couldn't describe the Surrender Act in such terms. It is absolutely clear, given the substance of the legislation, that it would achieve that and undermine the ability of the government to go and get a deal in the EU, which on all sides we want to achieve.
Diane Abbott!
So we can take it there is no apology from the Foreign Secretary. I raised a very specific point that the member for Dewsbury raised about the abuse she gets using the Prime Minister's own language. Yes. Mr. Speaker, deliberately disturbing billboards showing unborn fetuses have been put up in the London Borough of Walthamstow. They're upsetting for the women walking past, but particularly upsetting for the member for Walthamstow because these billboards are targeted at her in response to her work to decriminalise abortion in Northern Ireland. Abortion in Northern Ireland should be decriminalised on the 21st of October. What will the Foreign Secretary do to ensure that from later on this month, women in Northern Ireland will have the same human right to legal and safe abortion as women in England, Wales and Scotland?
Well, can I say to the Right Honourable Lady, and she's referred to the other Right Honourable member and the abuse that she's received, that I and all members of this House, I know, believe it is totally unacceptable. There is a place for free speech, but we should never allow that to cross over into abuse, intimidation or harassment of honourable members on all sides of this House going about their business. The most important thing we can do on the specific issue that she addresses is get the institutions in Northern Ireland back up and running so that they can exercise their rights, their prerogatives on the behalf of the people of Northern Ireland.
Diane Abbott!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I noticed the Foreign Secretary hasn't said anything about those horrific posters, not posters anyone would want to see, particularly someone who's actually pregnant, as the member for Walthamstow is. Mr. Speaker, Labour last week reiterated its call to end the rape clause, which forces women to fill out a 4-page form to prove their child was born of rape to get financial help. Will the Foreign Secretary today back Labour's pledge to remove the abhorrent rape clause from universal credit?
Well, I would say that we've looked at this issue and we continue to look at it. I think on the subject of using inflammatory language, it's incumbent on all sides of the House to be very careful about it. But I know that my right honourable friend the Secretary of State for DWP, looks at this and will continue to take questions and scrutinise this very carefully so we get the balance right. Of course, I would just gently say to her that on the Labour side, they want to abolish universal credit and engage in an open spending spree on handouts. That is the wrong thing to trapping people into the welfare trap. On our side, we want to help those people from the poorest backgrounds get into work, and our record speaks for itself.
Diane Abbott.
How more dismissive can the Foreign Secretary be to people and families dependent on benefit? We're not talking about a spending spree. We are talking about a system which is fair, which is just, and doesn't subject people to undue humiliation. Mr. Speaker, last week, the 100-year-old travel company, Thomas Cook, went out of business. We know that 72% of its workers are women. We also know that although governments around the world stepped in to save subsidiary Thomas Cook companies in their own countries, the UK Business Secretary thought it wasn't her job. Can the Foreign Secretary explain to those workers, some of whom are with us today, why their government sat idly by?
Well, first of all, I would say to the Shadow Home Secretary, we didn't sit idly by. The efforts of the government to make sure that those holiday makers and those travellers who are caught overseas could be returned back to the UK, coordinated by the Transport Secretary, have been very effective, and that has required a huge amount of cross-government work, including in my own department. In relation to whether the government should step in and bail out Thomas Cook, it's very clear, if you look at the financing behind it, that it wouldn't have rendered the company more sustainable. It wouldn't have saved the jobs in the long run. And we are, of course, concerned to make sure that in the long term we've got a sound economic basis. We've created 3 million new jobs in this country since 2010. We'll continue with that. What we're not going to do is routinely bail out companies that are unsustainable. That's not the right way to go.
Diane Abbott.
Nobody's asking the government to routinely bail out companies. What we are asking the government is, why won't you even meet with the workers? Mr. Speaker, whether it's women members in this House, women claiming benefits, women's reproductive rights in Northern Ireland, and the failure to support women workers at Thomas Cook, isn't this a government letting women down?
Well, I'd say to the Right Honourable Lady, on this side of the House, we're proud to be on our second female Prime Minister. And
I want to hear the First Secretary's answer. He's embarked on his answer. I want to hear it. I think the House will want to hear it, and everybody else will want to hear it. Mr. Raab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Labour front bench are pointing to my Right Honourable friend. Well, I'd like to take that opportunity to pay tribute to the Right Honourable member from Avon for her accomplishments in tackling human trafficking, for her accomplishments and drive to tackle violence against women, and for the domestic violence bill that we'll be introducing in this House today for further debate.
Diane Abbott.
The Foreign Secretary hasn't mentioned the fact that there are over 600,000 more women and girls in poverty now than in 2010. And can I just say gently to him, I was a member of this House when Tory MPs defenestrated the then female Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher. And I've been a member of this House. I've been a member of this House when Tory MPs worked their will to the immediate the immediate female Prime Minister. And it seems to me that Tory members of Parliament may on occasion make women their leaders, but they need to learn, they need to learn how to treat them less cruelly.
Well, can I just gently say to the Shadow Home Secretary in relation to Margaret Thatcher that if she wants to talk about treating them better, she might have a word with the Shadow Chancellor, who talked about going back in time to assassinate her. That's not appropriate language on her side. She talked about Labour's record. Can I just remind her that because of Labour's economic mismanagement, we saw female unemployment rise by over a quarter. Now they want more debt, more borrowing and higher taxes. On our side, we're proud. Female employment at record lows, higher percentage of women on FTSE 100 boards, and the gender pay gap at a record lower than under the last Labour government.
Order. I believe I'm right in saying that the Shadow Home Secretary has had her 6 questions. There will be more. Margot James.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the right honourable gentleman agree that legislation to establish a tough, independent regulator of internet companies empowered to challenge the automatic right to anonymity online be a priority for the Queen's speech?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We want to make the UK the safest place in the world to go online for our children, but also for all members of our society. And our online harms white paper set out our plans to make companies more responsible for their user safety online, especially for children. And it also sets out measures to reinforce powers to issue fines against those who put them at risk.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a disgrace that the Prime Minister is not here. Since he's been elected, since he was elected in July, he's only been to one Prime Minister's question. Quite simply, he's running scared from this chamber. Mr. Speaker, right now, the Prime Minister is setting out his Brexit fantasy at the Tory party conference. A deal that he knows is unacceptable and doomed to failure. When this deal fails, as they know it will, Downing Street sources have insisted the government will not seek an extension. They will not obey their legal obligations. Mr. Speaker, yet again, this Prime Minister is prepared to act unlawfully. Has the Prime Minister not learnt his lesson? He is not above the law. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm, are these sources correct, that the Prime Minister will not obey the law? Is this government seriously planning to take on Parliament in the courts to force through a catastrophic no-deal Brexit? Or will the Foreign Secretary now rule that out?
I say to the honourable member, of course this government will always adhere to the law. We are, at this moment, the Prime Minister has written to Jean-Claude Juncker setting out our proposals. We want to take forward the negotiations. We want to avoid a no-deal scenario. And actually, rather than undermining the negotiations in Brussels, I'd urge the SNP to try and support the government in securing a deal which is good for this country. He talks about respecting judgments. We will always respect legal judgments. I would call on the SNP to respect the judgment of the people of Scotland when it comes to staying in the United Kingdom, and the judgment of the people of the United Kingdom to give effect to the referendum on the EU.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, we will always respect legal judgment. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that this Prime Minister cannot be trusted, and his Foreign Secretary can't even commit the Prime Minister to the letter of the law. Mr. Speaker, this government must be stopped. I'm looking now at colleagues on opposition benches, and I urge them, we must unite. We must stop this Prime Minister by removing him from office. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish National Party stand ready to bring this government down. Other parties need to step up at this moment of national crisis. Prepare a vote of no confidence. Ensure a Brexit extension. Prevent a no deal. And call a general election. Doing nothing is not an option. We must act. So I ask the Foreign Secretary, will he give the Prime Minister a message from the Scottish National Party? It's not a case of if, but when. We will bring this dangerous government down.
I have to say to the honourable gentleman, he's at risk of sounding like he's all mouth and no trousers. because he had the chance to vote for a general election and he turned it down. He had the chance to avoid no deal, and the best chance now is to back this government in securing a good deal, good for the United Kingdom and good for all quarters of the United Kingdom, including the people of Scotland.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, I was out knocking on doors with my listening team, listening to the views of local people, as we do every week. The message to me, whether they will leave or remain voters, was crystal clear. Get Brexit done by the 31st of October. Deputy Prime Minister, can you reassure my constituents that we will leave the European Union by the end of this month, come what may, no ifs, no buts?
Can I thank my honourable friend? He gets straight to the crux of the matter. We must leave by the end of October, come what may. We're committed to doing that. The most effective way of doing that, which will unite this House, bring the country back together, is to get behind the Prime Minister's efforts to secure a good deal. And I think it's incumbent on all members on all sides of the House to support the United Kingdom rather than trying to undermine the negotiating position in Brussels.
Theresa Pearce.
Thank you. Housing, I believe, is the first of the social services. Without it, you can't have education, productivity or health. And the NHS has a diagnosis code for inadequate housing. And the Department of Health wrote to me saying that poor housing costs the NHS £1.4 billion a year, but that figure is now 4 years old. Will the Secretary of State ensure that I get up-to-date figures, that the Department of Health writes to me with the most up-to-date figures and places that information in the library?
Well, I thank the honourable lady. I'll certainly pass on the specific request to the Secretary of State for Housing. She's right to raise the issue of the quality of housing. When I was Housing Minister, we developed proposals for social housing green paper. We want the social housing tenants to feel like they're treated with respect. I remember meeting an individual who ran his own business. When he went to work, he was treated with respect. When he came back home to his housing association, he was treated disrespectfully. That's not right. And I would just gently say to her that we have delivered over 222,000 additional homes in the last year. That's the highest level in all but one of the last 31 years. And we've built more council housing than in the previous 13 years of the last Labour government.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, Sir John Major rang me about half an hour ago. Simply to give vent to his indignation, which I already fully shared, that a major policy announcement of historic significance, our last offer, apparently, to the EU of a withdrawal agreement, was being made not to this House of Commons, which is not even to have a statement, and not after discussion in the Cabinet, most of whose members know nothing about it, but in a speech to a Conservative Party conference in which the Prime Minister, who I remind you was one of those who voted to stop us leaving the European Union at the end of March, began the speech with an attack on Parliament. Now, I will, if a deal is obtained, I will be delighted. I will apologise to the Prime Minister and I will vote for any deal that is agreed amongst the 28 member states of the European Union. But can the Foreign Secretary reassure me that, because it seems to me obvious otherwise, that this is not just a party political campaigning ploy to blame the European Union for the lack of agreement and to arouse fury between people and Parliament so as to escape from the responsibility which seems to me to lie with the Spartans and the far right of the party with whom he and the Prime Minister used to be close allies.
I thank my right honourable friend. Can I just, on the specific point, the proposals that we are setting out to Brussels, and David Frost, the Prime Minister's Special Advisor, is over in Brussels doing that, will be set out first in the House of Commons. They will be published. No. The Shadow Foreign Secretary is chuntering from a sedentary position, but the proposals have not been set out in Manchester. They will be set out in written proposals to Jean-Claude Juncker, and they will be published in the House later on. And I would gently say to my right honourable friend, and I know later today the Shadow Foreign Minister is continuing to talk from a sedentary position, but I just say to my right honourable friend, he and I have always had slightly nuanced but differing views on the EU. But I think the one thing that we all want to do is get a deal right now, and that's why the attempts by Parliament to frustrate that have been deeply counterproductive, and also to give effect to the promises that on all sides of the House we made, to give effect to the referendum and to keep trust with the electorate of this country.
Eleanor Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's up-to-date of the National Planning Policy Framework, published in July 2018, changed the policy we have for generations of not building on the green belt. It's a policy that allows future development to be considered. Local planning authorities are now coming under great pressure from developers who don't want to spend the money to improve brownfield sites. Because of this, unspoilt areas like the 7 cornfields on the edge of my constituency are now under threat from inappropriate development by house builders who put profit above all else. We should not be building on these sites, especially at the time of the concerns for the environment. I'm asking the Prime Minister to review the Green Belt policy to protect the areas like the 7 cornfields from the developers.
Lady, and actually her concerns on this are shared right across the House, so I think it's something which will be of interest and importance to everyone here today. The National Planning Policy Framework is very clear. Greenbelt must be protected, brownfield sites must be brought forward, and in order to provide a greater boost to the supply of new housing, we've introduced measures to boost the density and the ability to raise up homes in more urban areas or suburban areas whilst protecting the Greenbelt. There has also been a huge amount of money that has gone in right across the country in terms of infrastructure development to make sure that we can build the right homes in the right places, but also answer the significant concerns of local communities who ask where will the schools, the housing, the roads come from. We're making sure that we give councils the support they need to build the right homes in the right places.
Miller.
The government is backing a new hospital to serve Basingstoke with money to develop our business case. Does my right honourable friend agree that a bid that could include new jobs, new state-of-the-art facilities and new homes is a bid that everybody in North Hampshire should get behind?
I thank my right honourable friend, and it sounds like a very tantalising proposal, and I'm sure the Health Secretary will look at it very carefully indeed. We've made clear that we're backing the NHS with the biggest cash boost in history, an extra £34 billion a year by 2023-24. You can only do that with a strong economy, and that's precisely what the Labour Party will put at risk.
Lucy Powell.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, my constituent Richard should have been paid. It was the first time in his life that he wasn't. Richard, like many others that I met with his union Unite, was a dedicated employee of Thomas Cook. Given that the warning signs were there for months, if not years, will the government use this extra parliamentary time that we've now got to bring forward emergency legislation to stop a further airline collapse? And will he pledge now to expedite Richard's redundancy pay and to recoup the millions taken by the directors in the last few months?
Well, can I first of all say that I feel for anyone, whether it's people stranded abroad or people that lost their jobs, in relation to the Thomas Cook scenario. I've set out the position of why the government doesn't systematically bail out or step in to prop up firms which are unsustainable. And I'm afraid if the Honourable Lady looks at those figures, I think she'll see that that wasn't a sustainable route to go. But of course, if she wants to write to me, we'll make sure we look at any of the details that she raised. But the bottom line is the way we create a healthy economy, the way we create jobs, is by making sure you've got the tax measures in place, you're not raising taxes on businesses, and you're supporting the workers of this country, and that's what we're doing.
Mr. Dominic Raab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend at being at the dispatch box as Deputy Prime Minister. How is it that the government is allowing special advisers at number 10 Downing Street, speaking on behalf of the government to tell outright lies. He should be familiar that on Saturday, such a special advisor, who I believe is Mr. Dominic Cummings, told the Mail on Sunday that a number of honourable members were in receipt of foreign funding in order to draft what is known as the Ben Act, something which in itself is totally untrue. But moreover went on to say that this was going to be the subject of a government investigation, something which is also completely untrue because, mercifully, this country is not yet run as a police state by Mr. Cummings.
Well, I thank my right honourable and noble and learned friend. I wasn't quite sure what the question there was, but the position of the government is that advisers advise and ministers decide. And in relation to the legislation, which we have rightly dubbed the Surrender Act, it is right that that gets the kind of scrutiny that a government would get, whether it's the scrutiny from the executive, parliamentary select committees in this House, or indeed the declarations of interest that should come forward in the normal way.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State set out clearly and unambiguously for this House in what circumstances will the Prime Minister write to the EU Council President as set out in the terms of the Ben Act?
Well, the government's been very clear. We will respect the law. We will respect the law, but we're not going to extend beyond the 31st of October. And I would ask all honourable members who signed up to that shoddy piece of legislation to reflect on the fact that with the multiple conditions, the £1 billion a month that it would cost the UK taxpayer, and undermining the position of the UK government to get a deal in Brussels, whether actually they're courting the no-deal scenario they pretend they want to avoid.
Shailish Bara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I join in the tributes paid earlier to the Right Honourable Lady on her historic achievement today. Mr. Speaker, today marks the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that his message of non-violence, religious tolerance and greater rights for women is as applicable today as it was in his lifetime?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I would go one further and tout the words of Martin Luther King, who said that we should, and I think on all sides of the House, believe in a society where you're judged on the content of your character, not the colour of your skin, let alone your gender. And that's why on this side of the House, we're proud of our record levels of BAME communities in employment, children from BAME communities taking more rigorous GCSEs. We've got the first Asian Chancellor, the first female Asian Home Secretary, and I'm proud to be in the most diverse cabinet in history.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Anne has an autoimmune condition and needs 20 tablets a day to control pain. This medicine is her lifeline, and without it, she could die. But she's been warned that a no-deal Brexit will mean a severe risk in their supply. Can the Secretary of State say why his government is willing to risk her life and many others by refusing to rule out no deal, choosing a policy of ruin over delay?
I have to say to the Honourable Lady that of course we share the concerns of anyone in the position of her constituency. That's why the head of the NHS, Sir Simon Stevens, and the Health Secretary have said that they have put in place all the necessary arrangements to make sure that in a no-deal scenario medicines will continue to flow across the border as required. But if she really wants to avoid a no-deal scenario, get behind this government, getting a good deal in Brussels, and that's the best thing for all concerned.
Amber Rudd.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my right honourable friend for his role today. I remember when my right honourable friend resigned from the Cabinet because of his disagreements with Brexit policy, a route I subsequently became familiar with. But does his experience not remind him that there are honourable different opinions across this House about how we leave the European Union, about how we interpret the will of the people, and the essential thing is that every member here representing their constituency has a role to play in that. And can I urge him, when working with my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, to make sure that any decisions, any progress is taken through this House?
I can give my right honourable friend that reassurance. I do understand, and we've always managed to stay on civil, cordial, even amiable terms throughout all the challenges of Brexit, and I think that's something that we should, on all sides of the House, seek to do. Parliament, of course, has got a crucial role to play. I don't think anyone can legitimately say Parliament hasn't, with the stalwart support of the Speaker, scrutinised Brexit at every stage. But we've also got to remember, on all sides, and particularly on this side, the promises we made to the voters to give effect to Brexit, to get Brexit done, and that's the way we can move on, unite the country and take Britain forward.
Mr. Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 27th of July, the Prime Minister in Manchester said he wanted to bring Northern Cities bus services up to the same level as London. Bus services are really important to my constituents, Mr. Speaker. The problem is that currently government funding on bus services in London is £75 a head. In Sheffield, it's £5 a head. While the Chancellor's announced a further £200 million for bus service, it would take half that money to bring Sheffield funding level alone up to the same as London. So I asked the Foreign Secretary, is the government really going to fund the better bus services that the Prime Minister promised for northern cities like Sheffield? Or once again, have we had a grand announcement for the Prime Minister, which on detailed examination simply isn't worth the paper it's written on?
Say to my honourable friend, the chairman of the Select Committee, we're absolutely committed to boosting bus services in his constituency and indeed infrastructure right across the country. That includes transport, that includes broadband, and that means making sure that we have a more balanced economy which can boost jobs, reduce deprivation, make sure we can fund the precious public services we need. And on the specific point he raised, I will ask the Secretary of State for MHCLG to write to him personally.
Sir Hugo Swire.
Mr. Speaker, within the last 24 hours, the DPRK has launched a possible submarine-based ballistic missile. If so, that would be the first submarine-based missile they've launched in 3 years. This is their 9th launch, I believe, since June. Has my right honourable friend had an opportunity to talk to other leaders within the region? And given that this is coming a few days before the resumption of talks with the United States, what assessment has he made of the continuing threat of the DPRK to the region and to the wider world?
My honourable friend, and pay tribute to his time at the Foreign Office. He was a very effective minister and he continues to make the case from the back benches. We are concerned about the situation in North Korea, and we do regularly raise this with our international partners. There have been a series of missile tests by Pyongyang, which are deeply troubling. We continue to make clear that they must show restraint and adhere to their legal commitments. And of course, there is some bluff and bluster in the lead-up to the talks with the US. What we would like to see is a de-escalation of tensions and a route to denuclearise North Korea.
Furness.
Mr. Speaker, this week I heard from Phil and Rachel Turner, my constituents whose 5-year-old daughter Eliza has cystic fibrosis. They are planning to move to Scotland so she can receive the life-changing drug Acombi on the NHS. Does the First Secretary of State agree with me it is a tragedy that families should have to root their lives in this way? Can he confirm today that funding will be found for children affected by this terrible disease so they can take up the treatment without delay? And furthermore, can I suggest that the government should support Labour's plan of setting up a publicly owned generic drugs manufacturer that would supply medicines to the NHS at affordable rates?
Can I just say that I feel for any family and any children in the situation that the Honourable Lady highlights. We're frustrated, as is everyone, that agreement hasn't been reached yet that will provide access to Acombi. We do have a system in NICE and with NHS England where it is for clinicians, not politicians, to determine the fair price for medicines. I have to gently say, I think the proposals that have been put forward by the Labour Party would put that at risk because they would repel investment, repel innovation, and that's not the right way to get medicines to the people that need them.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the First Secretary to turn his attention today to Hong Kong, where yesterday's events were truly awful. Obviously, the people suffering most are the victims of violence on both sides. But now a number of UK companies who have interests in Hong Kong are being adversely affected. As one of the guarantors of the Sino-British Joint Declaration supporting one country, two systems, is there now an argument for him discussing Hong Kong with China in the UN Security Council? And maybe the next 6-monthly report on the declaration could be an opportunity to do this.
And I thank my honourable and noble friend, and just say this: we are concerned about what we're seeing on the streets of Hong Kong. We of course condemn any violence by protesters, but the vast majority are seeking to exercise their right to peaceful protest. I think any response by the Hong Kong authorities needs to be proportionate, but what we need above all is to see a political process, a dialogue between the administration and the people of Hong Kong that can lead to the kind of political reform that's envisaged in the basic law and is reflected in the joint declaration that he cites.
Rick.
Mr. Speaker, the last Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Lady for Maidenhead, created a hostile environment for migrants which made them feel alienated and unwelcome in this country. Examples of this being the descendants of Windrush and now EU migrants. The current Prime Minister is creating an even more hostile environment towards anyone who doesn't agree with the UK leaving the EU on October the 31st without a deal, by invoking the language of war with talk of surrender, betrayal and capitulation. Why does this government feel the need to whip up such hatred, animosity and division when so many people are already suffering from his government's austerity?
Well, can I first say to the honourable gentleman that we're absolutely determined to correct the wrongs experienced by the Windrush generation. We've apologised for the mistakes that were made, and to date over 7,200 individuals have been given the documentation confirming their status. He talks about Brexit, and Brexit has been a divisive issue for this country in all parties and right across the people at large in this country. The best way of resolving that, bringing the country together, is get a deal, get Brexit done and move on. And it's incumbent on all sides of the Labour Party to get back and start thinking about the promises they've made and get behind this government as we strive for a good deal that works for the country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State join me in welcoming the £13.8 million of funding, hospital funding for East Sussex Healthcare Trust, which will be earmarked to upgrade Eastbourne Hospital, which many of my constituents use. A few years ago, Eastbourne Hospital was earmarked for closure. Under the Conservatives, it's now earmarked for investment.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I'm delighted with the new investment going into her constituency. We've backed the NHS with almost £34 billion a year by 2023-2024. There's an extra £1.8 billion going into 20 hospital upgrades, and we're also providing £250 million to boost artificial intelligence so we can improve earlier cancer detection, new dementia treatments and more personalised care. All that will be put at risk by a Labour Party or a Labour government that would tank the economy.
Toby Birkin.
Mr. Speaker, I recently met a victim of domestic violence who continues to live in isolation and terror even after the abusive relationship is over. This Parliament has a duty to her and to every victim of domestic violence to pass the Domestic Abuse Bill, which finally has its second reading today. Will the Foreign Secretary promise her that this life-saving legislation will not fall due to prorogation?
Well, I pay tribute to the honourable gentleman. We want to, I think, on all sides of this House, stand up and have absolute zero tolerance for any domestic abuse that may happen. The best way is for us to work together in, frankly, the kind of collaborate way that we haven't seen in recent months and years because of Brexit. This is an opportunity, and the opportunity will come today when we debate second reading the Domestic Violence Bill.
You Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year I attempted to introduce legislation which would require the banks to maintain or deliver a cash point to every high street that supports 5,000 residents or more on a free-to-use 24-hour basis. I was inspired, Mr. Speaker, because the tourist town of Battle lost its last cash point of that type. I'm grateful that Link have now seen the case for Battle, but I'm conscious that other high streets across the UK are not so fortunate. So could I ask the Deputy Prime Minister to help set up a meeting with me and ministers to help deliver a boost to all of our high streets?
I thank my honourable friend. I'll certainly pass on the point he's made directly to the Business Secretary and other ministers and see what more can be done in the specific neighbourhood that he talks about. The reality is that we do have businesses and high streets which are suffering, partly because of online competition, partly because of consumer trends. And what we need to try and make sure is that we boost high streets, we boost businesses, and in particular we boost the small businesses in this country that have created over 80% of the new jobs. And all of that will be put at risk by the frankly damaging and counterproductive policies that have been come up with, in particular this week, by the Shadow Chancellor.
Julie Elliott.
Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents in Sunderland who voted Leave are contacting me as they are petrified of the crash-out no-deal Brexit on top of years of hardship caused by Tory austerity. Will the Secretary of State confirm that the government will obey the law and request an extension of Article 50 so that people in Sunderland avoid the double whammy of no-deal Brexit on top of Tory austerity?
I have to say to the Honourable Lady that of course we'll adhere to the law, but the Prime Minister's been clear that we must leave by the end of October. That's in order to maintain public trust in our democracy and avoid the public feeling that politicians don't listen to what they've said. And if she wants to avoid a no-deal Brexit, get behind this government in securing a deal that all sides can support.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I was honoured to speak at the official opening of CAE's new flight simulator and aviation training centre at Gatwick Airport. Will my right honourable friend join me in welcoming this significant aviation inward investment into global Britain?
Thank you, honourable friend. It's absolutely crucial that we make this country the best place to invest for technology, for innovation, and that is part of the vision of global Britain. So I'm pay tribute to the project in his own constituency, and that's what we can deliver if we can get Brexit done and dusted and move on and allow the people of this country to move on.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman and the government talk about the will of the people and the need to restore trust in democracy when it comes to Brexit, whilst completely forgetting that over 16 million people voted for us to remain in the European Union, 13 million people chose to abstain in the referendum, and 1.5 million youngsters weren't eligible to vote, and they now want a say about their future. So on that basis, surely the way to protect democracy is to put any Brexit deal to a confirmatory referendum. Because if we don't have that people's vote, we will leave the European Union without the consent of the majority of people of this country.
Say to the Honourable Lady, and I know we've got different views on Brexit, but we've always got on professionally and civilly in the past, and I understand the passion with which she holds her views, but I think a second referendum would be the last thing this country wants. It would solve nothing, it would put at risk the Union, because it would be a political gift to the SNP. If she wants to avoid no deal, then she should back the government, not undermine it, as it strives for a good deal in Brussels.
Michael Tomlinson.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, and with the shape of a potential deal becoming clearer, will the First Secretary of State repeat and confirm his absolute commitment to leaving on the 31st of October, in contrast to the Lib Dems? And I don't think we have a single Lib Dem in the chamber this afternoon who wants to leave. Oh, we do. We have one. Forgive me, Mr. Speaker, I got that wrong. We have one Lib Dem in the chamber, in contrast to the Lib Dems who want to overturn the democratic result, and the Labour Party that doesn't quite yet know what it wants.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend? He's absolutely right. We need to get Brexit done. The country wants us to move on and to keep faith with the voters. And as for the position of the Liberal Democrats, of all the different views in the House of Commons, I find this the most difficult to understand. How you could have 16 Liberal Democrat MEPs actually writing to Jean-Claude Juncker, telling him not to negotiate, not to do a deal with the UK. That is deeply irresponsible and is courting the very outcome of a no-deal Brexit that they say they wish to avoid.
Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Did the Prime Minister, as today's Times reports, receive a request from President Trump for help in trying to discredit the Mueller report and the role of British and American intelligence in uncovering the Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections? And will he assure the House that no British Prime Minister would ever collude with any foreign leader to undermine or smear our security and intelligence services or damage their vital cooperation with their American colleagues.
The honourable member, can I first be clear that the Prime Minister is not going to comment on the discussions with President Trump that were held in private, but I can give him the assurance that, of course, neither the Prime Minister, or as then was the Foreign Secretary, nor any member of this government would collude in the way that he's described. That's, of course, entirely unacceptable and would never have happened and did not happen.
Thank you. Order. I will come to points of order. If the honourable lady will forgive me, and I will hear her fully, and other colleagues, which is important. I propose to take the presentation of bill first. Thank you. Presentation of bill, Geraint Davis.
Clean Air number 3, Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow, Thursday, the 3rd of October, Mr. Speaker.
Tomorrow, Thursday, the 3rd of October. Thank you. I would have thought it the normal course of events to proceed with the 10-minute rule motion, but if colleagues particularly want to raise their points of order now, a simple nod of the head of acquiescence in such an arrangement and empathy with it will suffice. And not surprisingly, the honourable gentleman, who's invariably of an amiable disposition, seems content that we proceed in that way. So we'll come to the honourable gentleman ere long. But first of all, I believe there's a very important point of order from the honourable lady, the member for Walthamstow. Point of order, Dr. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may, I should like to seek your advice. For the last 6 days, an organisation calling itself the Centre for Bioethical Reform UK has been waging a campaign of intimidation and harassment against myself and, by extension, my constituents in Walthamstow. From turning up in our town centre with a 20-foot banner of my head next to an image of a dead baby, of about the age of the baby I'm currently carrying myself, proclaiming that I am working hard to achieve such an outcome, to buying from Clear Channel billboards, advertising in my constituency, displaying graphic and scientifically incorrect pictures of fetuses near to schools, to libelling me on national radio as someone who wishes to see abortion up to birth, to their Stop Stella campaign, which explicitly encourages people to target me as a hypocrite for being pregnant and advocating for the right of all women to choose when to be.
Absolutely. Shame.
Walthamstow residents have made clear their distress at this behaviour. So have I, and that they've made their point and they disagree with me, and I understand that and ask them not to continue. Despite this, they have already stated they will keep returning and targeting me until I stop campaigning. Appalling. Already, I have received numerous threats and abusive messages which directly quote their material. As you expect, Mr. Speaker, I have sought police assistance against this harassment.
Where is it?
I'm sad to report as yet none has been given, including from the parliamentary authorities, although Sadiq Khan and Claire Coghill, the leader of my council, have been fantastic allies. And I have proposals for the domestic abuse bill, which I hope ministers will look on kindly to recognise this form of abuse. As I've always said to bullies, it's not my time you're going to waste. However, Mr. Speaker, perhaps one of the troubling things about importing this kind of campaigning into our politics, because they have said now they are going to extend their protest to other MPs, and they're clearly influencing debate in this place, as some, even in this chamber, have said that I wish to kill babies. It's how it's funded. Mr. Speaker, this organisation claims to be a charity in its constitution and its accounts, and in a statement it made to the BBC last October. Yet the Charity Commission have refused to register them. Nor is it clear whether they have repaid the gift aid that they've previously claimed under the auspices of this charity status. If not, given that they knew they weren't registered with the Charity Commission, this group has facilitated tax evasion, which of course is a criminal offence. Nor is it clear if they're complying with the rules for third-party campaigners in the run-up to an election, or whether they are accepting illegal foreign donations, given that they are part of a network of such organisations across the world. Sadly, as I understand, they've also threatened to sue journalists who ask them about these matters, so we cannot have clarity about who is funding this sustained campaign of intimidation. From an organisation whose counterparts in other countries have picketed maternity hospitals with babies' coffins and incited such hatred and radicalisation that it has resulted in violence, including a mass shooting in a Planned Parenthood in Colorado. Given the calls for a general election, tackling the potential consequences of organisations on this on our public debates must indeed be a priority for the Charity Commission, the Electoral Commission and indeed HMRC to investigate. I'm sure we would all want to know whether all taxes are paid, all donations declared and all donors legal for such groups. But I'm not sure, Mr Speaker, where we as parliamentarians can start in holding such a company to account for the toxic culture and approach they're bringing and the absence of police action. We cannot uphold free speech on any issue if we do not also hold to account those who seek to abuse it and the laws around campaigning. So perhaps, Mr Speaker, you have some suggestions for me so that we can ensure no MP, and indeed no other woman, has to go through what I've been going through in the last few days.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order. At the outset, I know she'll understand if I say that in respect of some of the other matters to do with tax treatment, funding, that she mentioned, I cannot comment. It's perfectly reasonable for the Honourable Lady to set out those matters, but they don't require a response from me and it would not in any way be authoritative. However, as far as what I regard as her major point is concerned, I will be absolutely explicit in my response. I believe that campaigning of that kind, with the intensity involved and the explicit public threat to its apparently endless continuation, is vile, unconscionable and despicable. There is a major difference, and it is important that we should be clear about this, between putting a point of view with considerable force and insistence on the matter of abortion or any other matter of public dispute on the one hand, and putting it in extreme and provocative terms, and in doing so saying, we will go on doing so until you stop exercising your right as a Member of Parliament to campaign for what you want. Give in to our intimidation, our threats and our bullying, or it will be the worse for you. That, to me, colleagues, I hope I carry the support of the majority of the House in saying this, is rank unacceptable. And it displays, if I may say so, and I will, an absence of any moral compass. Anybody who thinks seriously about these matters cannot seriously think that that is right. It would be wrong in any case, but for the Honourable Lady to be subject to that treatment when she herself is pregnant and those intimidating and harassing her, ultimately unsuccessfully, know that to be so is doubly appalling. With reference to what the Honourable Lady said, and it is a challenge which I take in good part, about thus far an absence of support from the House authorities, I am very disappointed to learn of that. I can't comment on the particulars. What I do undertake to do is to meet the Honourable Lady within 24 hours if she wishes to meet me, and I will, as appropriate, be accompanied by people in this House who are best placed to advise. I'm delighted that the Mayor of London and his team are supporting her, but she is entitled to proper and unstinting support from the House authorities. If she feels that that is not the case and there is more that we can do or things that we haven't done at all that we should be doing, then I'm determined that she should get that help. The Honourable Lady, of course I will come to the Minister, the Honourable Lady is respected across this House as an extremely dedicated, articulate and principled campaigner for her causes. Nothing on earth can be allowed to prevent her continuing in that vein. And although it is not a matter of order within the chamber, it is right that she should seek the support of Parliament's spokesperson as she wants to reinforce her right to go about her business in a legitimate way. She has that right, and I stand absolutely with her in insisting on the continued exercise of that right. Point of order, Minister Victoria Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I say, having discussed this matter just this morning with the Honourable Lady, the Government is similarly concerned about the nature of the campaign against her. And indeed, my right honourable friend on the Treasury bench, who the Treasury Minister has already communicated her concerns to his department. But the Home Secretary, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has already offered to meet the Honourable Lady. We take these allegations very seriously, and we will see what can be done.
Yes, of course. I hope that those replies, will do for now, but let's get together as I have suggested. And no doubt the Honourable Lady will want to meet with the Minister at the appropriate time. Of course. Point of order, Maria Caulfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the Honourable Lady's point of order, as someone who sits on the opposite side of the debate in the abortion debate, can I just express my solidarity with her? The abuse and the billboards do nothing to further the abortion debate. It's a very personal issue, and we should use this place as a forum for debate, but do it in a constructive, collaborative manner. And I just want to echo that they do not speak for all of us who may have a differing view on the abortion debate.
I hope colleagues will agree that that's a very welcome point of order from the Honourable Lady, and I think I thank her on the House's behalf for saying what she has said. I think that... thank you, colleagues. I think there was another point of order from the Honourable Gentleman for Cambridge on a wholly unrelated subject. A point of order, Mr. Daniel Zeichner.
Mr. Speaker, it is unrelated. In his statement to the House last week, the Prime Minister, in response to a question I raised about the instructions that had apparently been given by his advisor, Dominic Cummings, to bring together parts of government data, which is of significant concern to many people. The Prime Minister told me that I'd mentioned something about which I'm afraid I was hitherto unaware, which is a very polite response, but seemed to many of us somewhat surprising, given the publicity given to the issue and the fact that other honourable members had raised complaints with the Information Commissioner. And I wonder if Mr. Speaker, you could give me guidance on how the Prime Minister could perhaps be persuaded to return to the House to clarify the matter.
Well, I don't treat what the Honourable Gentleman says with any levity when I say that conflicting accounts of a government's position on a given subject are not a novel phenomenon. There have been many precedents for this under successive governments and in relation to a plethora of different departments, sometimes including number 10 Downing Street itself. So I don't sniff or cavil at what the Honourable Gentleman says, the apparent inconsistency which perturbs him, and I'm grateful to him for giving me notice that he would raise this matter. I don't think it is a point of order. He is seeking procedural advice. By the way, when I say it's not a point of order, I say for the intelligibility of our proceedings to people observing, the great majority of points of order are not points of order. They are ruses by which to raise matters of particular concern to members at the time. In the most recent case from the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow, quite the most compelling and pressing case to raise. As far as the Honourable Gentleman is concerned, I think he should work on this basis. If he wishes to pursue what he sees as a potentially or actually inaccurate parliamentary answer, he should take the short journey from here to the table office and seek advice on how to pursue it. In doing so, I hope he will forgive me if I say that he should adopt my, I think now established motto in these matters by way of advice. Persist, persist, persist. Table further questions. Do not take no for an answer. Write letters in a legitimate as opposed to an illegitimate way. In a legitimate way, I say to the Honourable Gentleman, make a nuisance of yourself, man. Very good. If there are no further points of order, we come now to the 10-minute rule motion for which the Honourable Gentleman has been so patiently and good-naturedly waiting. 10-minute rule motion, Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Mr Speaker. I beg that leave be given to bring in a bill to establish an independent advisory body to make recommendations on the equitable distribution of public expenditure across the United Kingdom. the calculation of block grants to devolved administrations, the implications of the devolution of tax-raising powers for the United Kingdom fiscal framework, and the resolution of fiscal disputes arising between the governments in the United Kingdom and for connected purposes. Mr Speaker, for decades, British governments, red and blue alike, have tinkered around the edges of a broken economic system without challenging its structural flaws. 9 of the 10 poorest regions in Northern Europe are located within the British state, as well as its richest by a country mile. These disgraceful geographical wealth inequalities are a record of shame. Successive British governments, even after the 2008 financial crash, have been too timid to challenge the economic status quo, which prizes consumer debt addiction and the financialisation of the economy. The former Chancellor, George Osborne, in response to the crash, used to talk a lot about geographical and sectoral economic rebalancing, but in reality there has been little action to match the rhetoric. Of the 12 nuts nations and regions of the British state, only 3, London, the south east of England and the east of England, are not in deficit. Recent international data has shown that the largest difference in economic prosperity in Europe was between inner London, the UK's richest region with a regional GDP rating of 614% of the EU average, and West Wales and the Valleys, the UK's poorest with a regional GDP of 68% of the EU average. London acts as a black hole, sucking in talent and investment from the rest of the UK and beyond. Perversely, this inequality further incentivises investment in London from the public and private sector alike, so the cycle continues unabated. That is why today I am introducing a bill to establish an independent advisory body to make recommendations on the equitable distribution of public expenditure across the British state. A new office for fair funding with delivering geographical wealth convergence as its statutory aim. In order to do that, it would advise on the calculations of block grants to devolved administrations. It would make recommendations on the implications of the devolution of tax-raising powers for the United Kingdom's fiscal framework, and it would act as an independent arbitrator in dealing with the resolution of fiscal disputes arising between the governments in the UK. There are constant misunderstandings and misstatements regarding the relative funding and public spending levels in Wales compared with other parts of the UK. 40 years after the introduction of the infamous Barnett formula, it is still very poorly misunderstood. The British government has, on a number of occasions, erroneously claimed that for every £100 of public spending in England, £120 is spent in Wales. While this may be the case for devolved spending, it is certainly not the case for total expenditure, a very different measure. Identifiable public expenditure per capita in Wales in 2015-16 was 113% of the England level. Total expenditure per capita in Wales, identifiable plus non-identifiable, was 110%, well below the 120% the Secretary of State claims. For the British state, it pays to keep the system as impenetrable as possible. Relative need, as used in consideration of funding for the devolved administrations, makes no allowances for the concept of pump priming, where additional funding is allocated for long-term capital investment in order to realise the latent economic potential of poorer performing geographical areas. This issue is well described in the first report of the UK 2070 Commission, which claims that the Treasury Green Book is biased in favour of capital investment in the most successful regions. It is also important to mitigate the self-reinforcing tendencies of the Treasury Green Book and cost-benefits analysis, where fast-growing places automatically move to the front of the queue for more public investment. One of the main reasons the British state currently has anemic economic growth is low productivity. The best way to boost productivity would be to invest in poorer performing areas. Instead, what we are likely to get from Brexit, Britannia and Chain Gang is even more money spent in London. The Public Accounts Committee published a report in July 2019 outlining several problems with the way in which funding is currently allocated to the devolved governments. It identified unnecessary complexity around funding arrangements, recommending that the Treasury becomes more transparent in the way it allocates funding. According to its conclusions, the allocation of funding outside Barnett formula without consequentials was unsatisfactory. For example, the dodgy deal with the DUP, which resulted in £1 billion extra funding, clearly undermined the little credibility that the Barnett formula had remaining. A lack of clarity on whether the block grant reflects need was reported, and the committee expressed concern at the impact of slower population growth on funding per head. The report also reiterated Plaid Cymru's concern regarding delays in the sharing of information by the Treasury with the devolved administrations on comparability factors included in the Statement of Funding Policy. The Statement of Funding Policy usually published alongside the Comprehensive Spending Review, sets out the comparability factors which are used in the calculation of the Barnett formula. The last set of comparability factors in relation to the spending programmes were published in 2015, with a departmental breakdown, with no material difference, published again in an addendum to the spending round last month. The comparability factors are decided unilaterally by the Treasury. This needs to be changed as a matter of priority. And, Mr Speaker, HS2 is a case in point.
Good point.
HS2 currently swallows up a third of the UK government support for rail, 2.1 billion out of a total of 6.4 billion in the year 2017-18. It is clear from published and leaked reports that HS2 will cost far more than the planned 56 billion, and reports indicate up to 100 billion in total. The Treasury categorised HS2 as a national project, with a comparability factor of 0% for Wales, while Scotland and Northern Ireland had a 100% score. As a result, full Barnett consequentials are payable to Scotland and Northern Ireland, but not to Wales. These are huge sums of money. If HS2 ends up costing £100 billion, full Barnett consequentials for Wales would amount to £5 billion. Transport expert Professor Stuart Cole has also demonstrated how HS2 will have negative consequences for Wales, particularly in the south of my country, as journey times to cities in the Midlands and the north of England are reduced and new technology encourages companies to areas with HS2 stations. Professor Cole's analysis was supported by a report from Green Gauge 21, which drew on analysis by KPMG that found that HS2 could reduce employment growth in Wales by 21,000 jobs between 2007 and 2040, as well as costing the economy of the south of my country £200 million per annum. My bill aims to put a stop to the unfair way in which those comparability factors are set by acting as an independent advisory body. Mr Speaker, with growing fiscal divergence and an evolving constitutional landscape, the need for such an independent body has never been greater. The 2014 Wales Act devolved certain tax and borrowing powers to Wales. The Act enables the Welsh Government to legislate in respect of stamp duty land tax, landfill tax, and for the partial devolution of income tax to Wales. A fiscal framework was negotiated between the British Government and the Welsh Government to establish rules for determining matters resulting from fiscal devolution. At the moment, the three Welsh rates are set at 10p, maintaining parity with England, but with the possibility of further devolution and greater fiscal divergence, the current mechanism for developing and negotiating the fiscal framework is unsustainable. Significant concerns remain with regard to the dispute resolution mechanism within the framework. If no agreement is reached, the status quo remains. How can the devolved administrations get a fair hearing if the UK Government, who they are raising the dispute with, is paying judge, jury and executioner? The Office for Fair Funding, established by using my bill, would act as a system for independent arbitration. Finally, there is international precedent for an independent Office for Fair Funding. In South Africa, the Financial and Fiscal Commission is an independent body that does not directly determine expenditure allocations formula, but advises the South African Government. The South African Government has to consult the FC regarding the division of revenue between different tiers of government. In Australia, allocations of federal funding to the 6 states and 2 territories are overseen by the Commonwealth Grants Commission. This is a statutory, independent, non-partisan body. The CGC was discussed in the 2009 report from the Lords Select Committee on the Barnett Formula. The committee recommended that a similar body be set up for the UK. While the Office of Fair Funding would not solve the fundamental imbalances at the heart of the British state, it could at least give Wales and other neglected areas the tools to start improving our infrastructure and diversify our economies. Brexit is not an excuse to reassert Westminster control over Wales. This bill would help create a level playing field between the nations of the British state. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Well,
thank you. Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. The friends of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Liz Saville-Roberts, Gito Bebb, Anna McMorrin, Jane Dodds, Caroline Lucas, Ben Lake, Howell Williams and myself, sir.
Oh, very good. Yes, good idea to have the bill as well. Very well done. Jonathan Edwards. clarified.
Public Expenditure and Taxation Advisory Body Bill.
Second reading what day? Tomorrow. Thank you. Order. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Domestic Abuse Bill, second reading.
No. I will call the Minister momentarily, the Secretary of State for Justice, to move the second reading of the bill. And just before I do so, and in recognition of the fact that, of course, there are no time limits on front-bench speeches, I just tell the House that over 40 honourable and right honourable members are seeking to catch the eye of the Chair. So I know that colleagues will want sensitively to take account of that in framing their contributions. To move the second reading, I call the Secretary of State for Justice, Mr. Robert Buckland.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and mindful of the information you've kindly furnished to the House, I think you know that I'm historically generous at accepting interventions. I will tailor my generosity today because I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to take part in this landmark debate. I look around the chamber today on all sides and I see colleagues who have all played a huge contribution to getting to where we are today. We still have a long way to go, but I'm very pleased, encouraged and proud to see parliamentarians of all colours who have put their shoulder to the wheel when it comes to the challenge that we have faced, the challenge that has frankly been too big for too long. And the government has consistently made clear our continued determination to tackle the scourge of domestic abuse. And of course, legislation and this bill, however landmark it might be, is only one aspect of the work that needs to be done and that we are undertaking right across government to diminish the prevalence and impact of domestic abuse and to make it clear to the public that we have zero tolerance of abusers. And it's not just the Ministry of Justice, it's the Home Office, it's the Department of Local Government, it's the Department of Health, and I'm glad to be supported by ministers from all those departments and indeed all of government who need to put our metaphorical shoulder to the wheel. This bill puts victims, the needs of victims front and centre, Mr. Speaker, by providing additional protections, strengthening the response of agencies and amplifying the voice of victims, because we are determined to ensure that victims feel safe and supported, both in seeking help and in the rebuilding of their lives. And I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you very much for giving way. As the daughter of a social worker who has spent her entire career working alongside children and families and supporting those who are victims of domestic abuse, will you join me in thanking those hard-working social workers and indeed the police officers who are often the first line of response, but also the charities across the country who do support victims of domestic abuse?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and she's right at the get-go to remind us of the importance of coordination of approach that all of us, including members of Parliament, need to be domestic abuse aware, to understand that it will present in a myriad of different ways, in a myriad of different circumstances, and we all need to understand that. And I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Minister very much for giving way. Domestic abuse is a leading cause of homelessness, and some of the most harrowing cases I have dealt with as a constituency MP have involved the difficulty faced by survivors of abuse in accessing safe, secure housing. Will he undertake in this bill to ensure that survivors of domestic abuse automatically have priority need status for housing, and most importantly, that local authorities are fully and sustainably funded to deliver that obligation?
Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising that issue. I think this bill is an opportunity for us to delve right into that issue. And I think at second reading it's important that we outline these principles. At committee we will have opportunity to debate the detail. I'm particularly interested in the points that she makes. I want to make this bill as good as possible. And I'm going to need the help not just of colleagues in government but all honourable members in order to do that. Can I just make a little bit of progress? And I will, as I've said, be as generous as I can. Can I take the House back 25 years to a case in the Crown Court at Carmarthen, a case involving a young couple. He was charged with assault against his wife. A young barrister had been given that case. That was me. I remember seeing photographs of the victim's injuries. I was 24 at the time, not really that worldly wise. I looked at the photographs of this woman's eyes. They were bloodshot and they were bruised. The police had got there in time to take photographs of the injuries, something of a rarity in those days. And I'd immediately thought that she'd been the victim of a direct assault by punching. But I was wrong about that, because what had happened to her was that she'd been strangled. And strangulation causes those types of injury. The victim came to court. Frankly, I couldn't see what the defence was to this case, but my instructions were to plough on nonetheless. And I saw a frightened and frankly terrified woman having to come to this rather grand and old-fashioned court. Luckily, the judge was a humane, sensible and sensitive judge. But there was a problem. She didn't want to follow through and give evidence. The judge called her into court and called her to the stand because he was concerned about what was happening, and he asked her to explain why. And she said that she still loved him, that she wanted to be with him, and that she didn't want to put him through the stress of a Crown Court trial. And with that, the case was over. He was acquitted, they went on their way, and I was left thinking, is that really the end? And in fact, was it really the beginning of the domestic abuse that we all recognise? That particular story has haunted me all my professional life. The evidence shows that victims of domestic abuse will often be the victims for dozens of occasions before they even call the police or the authorities. These victims are suffering in silence for often years, and we are unable to reach them. I'll give way in a moment because I've not finished this particular part of my speech. I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that the days of the courts approaching abuse as just a domestic have happily gone. But my goodness me, we still have a heck of a way to go. And I just want to give you one statistic before giving way, and of course, that in the year ending March of 2018, some 2 million adults between 16 and 59 years of age experienced domestic abuse. 2 million people like the woman I was telling you about, whose everyday lives are blighted by abuse and who live with those effects, be they physical or be they emotional. So you can see the high degree of duty that we have to them by passing this legislation. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm very grateful for him giving way. One of the other aspects that's highlighted by his incredibly moving and powerful story is just how long survivors of domestic abuse have been waiting for this kind of legislation. 25 years, much longer, but also for the last 3 years, where government has been promising to outlaw cross-examination by perpetrators of domestic violence. People have waited so long. Can he now give the commitment? This bill will be seen through before the House is prorogued once more. If not, it would be the final straw for many, many very vulnerable people.
Can I pay warm tribute to the Honourable Gentleman, who has been an assiduous campaigner on this? And, of course, the issue of domestic abuse is predominantly experienced by women, but, of course, there are many, many relationships in our society. We know about men who suffer in silence as well. We are speaking for everybody, whatever their gender or orientation or classification. This is for everybody. And can I just say, on the carryover, the motion is on the order paper, and I know honourable members will want to support it. This bill will be carried over, an important sign of our deep commitment to this issue. And I'll give way to the honourable lady.
to my right honourable friend still for giving way, and I only wish that the very moving story he's told was some exception. Sadly, as he and I and many others who've practised at the criminal bar and indeed as solicitors will know, it's all too common a story still today. Just 2 quick points which I hope he can answer. One, will this act ensure that our police change their attitude? He's right about the courts and the judiciary, but what about our police who still, I fear, still think of these as being domestics? And secondly, would he meet with me to discuss what's happening in our courts where there are now far too long a delay between complaint and trial, up to 2 to 3 years? That's not fair on the victims.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. Of course, on point 2, I will meet her. On point 1, I think the importance is what we do to really embed the legislation, and that has to be by way of further training and really seeing the operational effect of the strategy that we set out and the direction that primary legislation is taking. So I'm grateful to her, and I'll give way to the Chairman of the Justice Select Committee.
I'm really grateful to my right honourable and learned friend for giving way. I too have seen examples of such as he quoted in practice, and I particularly welcome, therefore, the provisions in Clause 75 of the Bill in relation to the prohibition of cross-examination by the abusive party. But as the Bill goes forward, will he perhaps and his colleagues bear in mind in particular the legitimate issues raised by way of potential improvement by the Law Society and others in this field, that, for example, not only must there be proper remuneration and a proper system for instructing the representatives instructed to carry out the cross-examination in the interest of justice, but also to consider whether or not in certain circumstances examination in chief might also be included, for example, where the allegedly abusive party seeks to call the child of the relationship in support of their case. That too could cause real distress.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend. He's absolutely right to talk about his experience and also the issues I think that we can really tease out in committee here on how far we need to go. But I'd like to make some progress. I'll give way in a moment, but I'd just like to make a little progress. I just want to talk about the fact that the abuse is not just a direct impact, but also the impact upon the wider family. Most appallingly and sadly, by children and young people who can suffer both the short and long-term emotional and behavioural effects of abuse. Because we know, Mr. Speaker, that children who witness domestic abuse in the home are far more likely to experience abuse by a partner as an adult. And therefore it's our role as a government and as a parliament to do all that we can to protect our children from having to suffer as a consequence of this abuse and to ensure that agencies, national and local, recognise their needs and respond to them. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
My honourable friend's giving a very powerful speech and using some amazing examples, and I'm sure most of us have come across these sorts of stories, maybe sometimes in our own families, where people don't believe that the person who is the perpetrator is at fault. They think it's them that is at fault. But the honourable member mentioned physical, emotional and economic abuse. And I think this is the crux of the problem because it's widened out the definition. And I absolutely welcome this bill. But how does he expect it to not only provide protection for victims, but also help expose and bring the vile perpetrators to justice?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. I pay tribute for her continuing commitment to reform and improvement in this area. What I'd say to us, I think the widening of the definition from financial to economic abuse captures, I think, the sort of manipulation that can happen, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of other benefits, where we know through coercive control, and I'm proud to have played my part as a junior minister in making sure that that went onto the statute book as a criminal offence some years ago, that we continue to reinforce the message that abuse is not just about violence, important though it is, the insidious and the collective impact of it can change the lives of far too many victims. And I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
To the Secretary of State, and can I commend him and indeed particularly the Honourable Lady, the member for Louth and Horncastle, for the work they've been doing on this issue. We have raised on a number of occasions now that when we want to embed legislation that provides the best protection
the Secretary of State will know that this legislation has some particular definitions that are unique to Northern Ireland within it. One thing we are devoid of in Northern Ireland is legislative protection from stalking. And I do hope that he can give some thoughtful consideration during the passage of this bill to incorporating measures to ensure that whether it be domestic connections or not, that is legislation we need for the individual victim and for their families. And could he give some thoughtful consideration to the inclusion of Northern Ireland members of this House on the Bill Committee?
Well, I'm very grateful to him, and on the last point, of course, the business managers have heard him loud and clear. What I'm very keen to make sure is that this bill maintains its focus on domestic abuse. Now, I do not pretend, Mr. Speaker, that we can somehow hermetically seal the issue from the other aspects of criminal behaviour and abuse, such as stalking. What I would say to him is that I think the best place for stalking legislation would be in a discrete piece of work, and I would draw his attention to the work that we did in England and Wales when we as a House, and I was part of the all-party group who really campaigned and worked at pace to get stalking criminalised in England and Wales. I'm going to give him encouragement, but I really want to make sure this bill is focused. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank the Minister for giving way. I have just returned from the Council of Europe, where members across parties, and particularly in the social group, have expressed horror that it has taken 7 years and counting for the UK to ratify the Istanbul Convention. And one of the critical things about ratifying the Istanbul Convention is the treatment of women in Northern Ireland, and the fact they do not have the protections that the Minister has just suggested should not be in this bill. Now, the government gave a pledge and indeed told the Council of Europe that this bill was about ratifying the Istanbul Convention. There is a motion of recommendation at the about the Istanbul Convention in the UK right now at the Council of Europe. Can he give that assurance that he will not leave the women of Northern Ireland out of the Istanbul Convention, let alone the migrant women in this country who need us to put that legislation together too?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and she makes an important point about the Istanbul Convention. Of course, we've passed domestic legislation about it as well. And of course, I want to make sure that every aspect of that convention is underpinned in domestic law throughout the length and breadth of the United Kingdom. What I'm simply saying, as a legislator, somebody who wants to make sure that we get the bill in the best possible position, is that I want to make sure that we get it in the right vehicle. Now, look, if it is the will of the House that this is the right vehicle, of course that will be respected. But I think I'm entitled to make that point in terms of what I regard as the real focus of this bill. And, you know, I speak as somebody who actively and enthusiastically has supported the criminalisation of stalking, as has she, for many years. And I'll give way to the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. I would really urge him to reconsider on this. We have a bill before us. We have the opportunity to address the issue of stalking, and there is considerable overlap. Many cases which may begin as domestic abuse once a relationship splits up become terrible cases of stalking. And there are perpetrators who may, in some cases, be involved in domestic abuse, in others be involved in stalking, but they are serial perpetrators of violence and abuse.
Absolutely.
Of course, and the Honourable Lady makes an absolutely important point, and she'll know that my decision to extend the unduly lenient sentence scheme to cover stalking offences really reinforces my personal commitment and my deep understanding of the link between stalking and obsessional behaviour and the commission of often sexual offences, offences of violence or homicide. I absolutely get that. But I think it's right that we tease out these issues in committee and look again at report stage. And of course, if it is the will of this House, then we will do it. And I'll give way to the Chair of the Health Select Committee.
Thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He may know that I took the Stalking Protection Act through this House and received royal assent in March this year. Can he update the House when it will come into force?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I pay tribute for her work on this important issue and getting that bill through Parliament. I will make sure that that information is furnished to the Honourable Lady through the course of the debate. Of course, we are brilliantly served by the Parliamentary Under-Secretary, the Honourable Lady Member for Louth and Horncastle. She will respond to the debate. I'm not going to give way for the moment. I see certain party representatives I want to make sure are involved, but I just want to pursue one matter here, which is we've talked about the moral case for pursuing this. But there is also an economic case, a case of financial responsibility, because research has established that the cost of domestic abuse was approximately 66 billion for victims in England and Wales in the year ending March 2017. The biggest component of that cost is the physical and emotional harm incurred by them, but the cost to our economy and indeed to our health service is also considerable. Domestic abuse makes up one-third, Mr. Speaker, of all violent crime reported to the police. So the case for removal is clear, but the challenge is not easy. The dynamics are complex, and it means that much of that domestic abuse is hidden. And there are significant barriers to victims in seeking help, and of course the difficulty in escaping from an abusive relationship, which is why we need a cross-government, multi-pronged approach to tackling it. So the bill is not only part of that approach, but it demonstrates the breadth of our ambition in both showing strong leadership and taking decisive action to help end the suffering and harm. And I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful. And can I say how much I welcome his commitment to take a zero-tolerance approach to domestic violence and to stick up for the victims. Following his very welcome speech at the Conservative Party conference this week, where he pledged to end automatic early release of certain prisoners, would he be able to confirm that people who commit violence as part of domestic abuse will be included in that, and they will no longer be eligible for release halfway through their prison sentence?
Yes, I can, because people convicted of offences of the domestic element will often be convicted of the most serious violent offences and indeed sexual offences, and therefore under my proposals automatic early release will apply at 2/3 rather than 1/2 of the sentence. And I furnished the House with a written ministerial statement on that, yes, and I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Sexual exploitation is one of those heinous forms of abuse that can be perpetrated in situations of domestic abuse. This is where a victim is coerced or forced to perform sex acts in return for money, accommodation, employment, services or goods. Does the right honourable member agree with me that it is vital that the Domestic Abuse Bill explicitly recognises sexual exploitation as a form of domestic abuse?
He's absolutely right, and in the definition it does that. And I look forward to the more detailed debate to see how fully we can reflect the important point that he made. I see the Honourable Lady from Plaid Cymru, Dwyfa Marion. I'll give way to her.
Very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. I think he will recognise that we have an interesting situation here between England and Wales, because this legislation applies to England and Wales, and yet Wales actually has its own legislature and has legislated in this area in 2015. Will he commit to me that Wales will be properly represented on all the scrutiny and advisory boards to which are affected by this, including the answerability of the Commissioner for Domestic Abuse?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. She was, of course, a part of the Joint Committee and has an impressive track record on this issue, and I've very much appreciated the work that we've done together on these issues. I can give her that assurance. It is quite clear that all parts of the joint jurisdiction need to be adequately represented. And I just wanted to develop the point. I've just made a point about the Joint Committee. It was chaired by my Right Honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, my Right Honourable friend, and she did an important and wonderful job, and I want to put on record my thanks to her and all other members for what they've done. And the government has taken on board many of those helpful recommendations, and I think that the bill is a better one as a result of that work. And I'm conscious that there are a small number of outstanding recommendations which have yet to respond to, but we will provide an update on those at committee stage. And I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman from Leinster.
I'm deeply grateful, and to my right honourable friend, he's been characteristically generous, giving way. Can I welcome the establishment of a domestic abuse commissioner? Because my fear is that there's no doubt that this is an important and vital piece of